Discuss House Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman Michael McCaul, Republican of Texas. Chairman McCaul, thanks so much for being with us. So one of the biggest subjects on the NATO agenda, whether to fast-track Ukraine's push to join NATO. I want you to take a listen to what President Zelensky told my colleague Aaron Burnett this week.
The U.S. decide today whether Ukraine will get invited to NATO. This is today's situation, and it's a fact. The majority of the NATO countries support inviting Ukraine to NATO.
The majority support.
Those who have their doubts look only at President Biden, and he knows that this depends on him. It will be his decision.
Do you think President Biden should support an expedited process for Ukraine to join NATO?
I think it should be incremental, Jake. I think first, they have to win the counteroffensive. Secondly, have a ceasefire, then negotiate a peace settlement. We cannot admit Ukraine into NATO immediately. That would put us at war with Russia under Article 5 of the United Nations. So I think what the conversation is going to be about is what security agreements can be put in place with Ukraine as a predicate to perhaps NATO ascension of Ukraine into NATO. But I think it's way too premature to be talking about that. But I do think just the talk about it does provide deterrence against Russia, but we have to be careful in the way we do this. Now, remember back in the Budapest Agreement, they gave up all their nuclear weapons to Russia, and then we threw them under the bus with that agreement. If we do another security agreement with NATO, with Ukraine, it has to be one that's solid, that all of NATO is behind as a security agreement. The issue of ascension into NATO is a whole different issue.
Yeah, you referred to the NATO Charter, Article 5, an attack on one is an attack on all. So after the war is over, which presumably is a day that will come at some point, would you then support admitting Ukraine into NATO?
Yes, but it would have to be done, again, incrementally. I think a security agreement with Ukraine to lay the predicate down the road, they would have to come up to certain standards within NATO qualifications to be admitted. But I think, if anything, Jake, they've demonstrated a will to fight, a will for freedom and democracy against tyranny and oppression. I think they've earned it, but we have to put it on the right path forward, not an immediate ascension into NATO.
So let's talk about cluster bombs, because you've been calling for the U.S. government to give cluster bombs to Ukraine for months, and now President Biden has agreed to do so. Canada, Mexico, all of Western Europe, dozens of other countries, in fact, a majority of countries throughout the globe have all banned cluster bombs because they can cause indiscriminate damage. They can kill civilians, especially later if they fail to detonate. The U.S. is still spending millions cleaning up cluster bombs in Laos from the 1960s. Do you have any reservations about giving cluster bombs to Ukraine?
Well, you're right. Geneva Convention, there are signatories to that convention who do not agree with these munitions. We are not a signatory to the Geneva Convention on cluster munitions. Neither is Ukraine. And by the way, Russia is dropping with impunity cluster bombs in Ukraine, in the country of Ukraine right now. All the Ukrainians and Zelensky are asking for is to give them the same weapons the Russians have to use in their own country against Russians who are in their own country. They do not want these to be used in Russia. They want these as self-defense to use against Russians in their own country of Ukraine. I don't see anything wrong with that because, quite honestly, Jake, as you look at the counteroffensive, it's been slowed tremendously because this administration has been so slow to get the weapons in. These weapons would be a game changer. They are highly effective, and particularly hitting flanks of troops inside of Ukraine. They would be a game changer in the counteroffensive, and I'm really pleased the administration has finally agreed to do this. But lastly, ATACMS, my committee, we voted bipartisan to release those ATACMS, longer-range artillery that can hit the Iranian drones in Crimea. And also the F-16s need to get in country as soon as possible to deliver the Storm Shadows that the UK has put in there as well. But it'll take a while to train the pilots. But we got to move all this quickly and stop spending so much time.
Let's turn to China. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen was just there trying to strike a balance between competition and cooperation with Beijing. She tried to confront China on trade, on manufacturing, on the climate crisis. Were you satisfied with the Biden administration's message on this trip?
You know, I think just to get the meetings, they made a lot of concessions on sanctions and export controls. I would like this to be. It is a great power competition. I think she was willing to say we're not in a conflict or in a competition. This is just, we're just trading partners. I think that's a little bit devoid of reality. I think it's good to have diplomacy. I think it's good to have discussions moving forward. But what has China done? Their response is export controls on rare earth minerals. As a result of this meeting, they're going to cut exports of rare earth minerals to the United States in what would be considered a trade action or a trade embargo. And this highlights the bigger, great power competition we have with China. First, semiconductors that I took on with the CHIPS Act. Now we got the rare earth minerals. Globally, China controls about 85% of those critical minerals. We have to compete with them in every continent, including Africa, South America, Indo-Pacific, and we're not doing adequately so far.
Speaking of those special minerals, let's turn to Afghanistan, because it was 2 Fridays ago when the Biden administration chose late Friday afternoon before the long 4th of July weekend to release a damning Afghanistan report that faulted both the Biden administration and the Trump administration for the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. I want you to take a listen to President Biden's response to that report.
You would admit there was mistakes during the withdrawal and before?
No, all the evidence is coming back there. Remember what I said about Afghanistan? I said Al-Qaeda would not be there. I said it wouldn't be there. I said we'd get help from the Taliban. What's happening now? What's going on? Read your press. I was right.
So just in case not everybody out there could hear, the question was, do you admit there were mistakes during the withdrawal before? And President Biden said, no. All the evidence is coming back. Do you remember what I said about Afghanistan? I said Al-Qaeda would not be there. I said it wouldn't be there. I said we'd get help from the Taliban. What's happening now? What's going on? Read your press. I was right. What's your reaction?
It's devoid of reality. Jake, it's a little bit eerie that a president of the United States would have be so disillusioned about what's happening on the ground in Afghanistan. The idea that Al-Qaeda is gone, his own, Secretary of Defense and Joint Chiefs of Staff Milley have said Al-Qaeda is on the rise in Afghanistan. He's saying they're gone. He's saying the Taliban are helping us. What happened right after he withdrew? Zawahiri, was harbored by the Haqqani network, which is Al-Qaeda, essentially. So you got Haqqani, the Taliban, harboring Zawahiri Al-Qaeda, bin Laden's number 2 guy in Afghanistan right after the fall, and now he's saying, I was right, the Taliban's helping us, and Al-Qaeda's gone. I just don't really understand it. It's a bit bizarre to me that a president would be so devoid of his own foreign policy, and he just really wants to sweep Afghanistan under the rug. That report was very damaging, found that we should not have abandoned Bagram, where we had over $7 billion of taxpayer weapons left behind, that now, by the way, the Taliban are selling to our adversaries like Iran and the Palestinians against Israel. This is a huge foreign policy blunder.
You're in Miami right now. As anybody who's looking at the screen and sees the top right bug where it says your location, Tuesday is going to mark 2 years since protesters in Cuba took to the streets in the largest anti-Cuban government demonstration in a decade. And then you're in Florida, you say, to meet with Cuban American activists tomorrow. Do you support regime change in Cuba? Do you think that's the only path forward?
Well, I think we have to be careful in South America about regime change. We've had a history of that. I support the people of Cuba. I support them. If they want an uprising against their leadership, we should support them in that effort. I will be with them tomorrow. They're very passionate about their country. They want their country back. They want freedom and democracy in Cuba. And what is happening in Cuba right now? China is in Cuba. We have latest reports now that the Chinese are setting up a spy station in Cuba, the likes of which we haven't seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And where am I sitting? Southcom in Miami, CENTCOM, which is Central Command, that's all the Middle East. Southcom is Central and South America, our military. JIATF is our intelligence task force in Key West. All these facilities, Jake, 90 miles away from that tiny island from where I sit right here in Miami, 90 miles that can intercept through Huawei and ZTE and a spy station, our intelligence communications. That is a clear and present danger and a threat to the security of the United States, just 90 miles off the coast here.
The chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Congressman Michael McCaul, Republican of Texas. Good to see you, sir. Thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Jake. Thanks for having me.
My next